Henry Longfellow met Fanny Appleton when they were both visiting Switzerland in July of 1836. He fell for her almost instantly, and while it took her a little longer to warm up to him, they married on July 13th, 1843. They filled their house with books, art, friends, and 5 children who survived to adulthood. Their happy life together was abruptly shattered, though, on July 10th, 1861, with Fanny Longfellow's sudden and tragic death. Her family was devastated, and Longfellow fell into a depressive spiral he never fully recovered from. In 1862, after the first shock of grief had subsided, Longfellow turned to a somewhat unlikely source of comfort, the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri. The Divine Comedy had always held a special place in his heart. He received a copy of it from a friend when he was 21 years old, and was so inspired by the work that he would go on to teach it at Harvard. The story took on a new, deeper meaning for the grieving Longfellow, though, in the aftermath of this tragedy. At the insistence of his son, Charlie, who had been attending Dante classes at Harvard, Longfellow began reading Purgatorio to his children. Not long after, he began translating the work from Italian into English. The Divine Comedy genuinely seemed to help him process his grief, as much of the pain and emotions that Dante expressed were emotions Longfellow himself was trying to make sense of. On the anniversary of his engagement to Fanny, for example, he wrote out a quote from Inferno's Canto 5 in his journal, which roughly translates to, "There is no greater sadness than to remember past happiness." In March of 1863, his son Charlie also ran away from home to fight in the Civil War, adding yet another layer to his grief. As his work on translating the poem continued, Longfellow's friends began to notice the positive effect that the project was having on him. One by one, they began visiting the house to encourage him to keep up his progress and read out loud his translations. Every once in a while, they would offer Longfellow suggestions, and before long, he started seeking out their opinions. The informal visits soon turned into formal ones, and on October 25th, 1865, Longfellow recorded in his journal, "Lowell, Norton, and myself had the first meeting of our Dante Club. We read the 25 Purgatorio, and then had a little supper. We are to meet every Wednesday evening in my home." The Dante Club had officially been born. Members of the Dante Club included Longfellow himself, James Russell Lowell, Charles Eliot Norton, William Dean Howells, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., George Washington Green, and Trap, Longfellow's pet dog, to name a few. Every Wednesday, the club would convene to discuss their sometimes heated thoughts on the latest translated canto proof, before grabbing a late dinner and carousing late into the night. The club managed to finish the translation of Inferno in time to celebrate Dante's 600th birthday, and in 1867, the complete translation of the Divine Comedy was published. The translation became a surprise hit, and helped to bring the Divine Comedy into American culture for the first time. Though the club formally disbanded after that, the group of friends continued to meet. The club had provided Longfellow with support and purpose after the death of his wife. None of them, Longfellow especially, wanted to give that up. Much of the Divine Comedy follows Dante's long journey from hell up to heaven, where he hoped to be reunited with his lost love, Beatrice. The blend of loss, sorrow, pain, and hope expressed in the Divine Comedy mirrored what Longfellow himself was feeling and trying to make sense of. Translating and processing Dante's grief seems to have helped Longfellow process his own. Reading and writing stories or poetry can help us get through difficult times. What stories do you seek out when you need a source of comfort?